Ninth Amendment reserves rights to the people. The 10th Amendment reserves powers to the states. In both cases, limiting the power of the federal government. So the first question we should ask when we think about the Supreme Court and the Constitution is not what rights the court will find in the Constitution. The first question is whether the power the government claims has ever been authorized. By first asking, not whether the individual has a right, but whether the government has a power, not only do we get the order right, but more importantly, we shift the focus to the government. The burden is on the government to show where it gets the authority, if anywhere, to nationalize health care, to prohibit the use of marijuana, to whatever the government seeks to do. Ours is a limited government, and government can act only under some enumerated power. So we should insist that this authority be shown, failing which, it can't be shown, the presumption in favor of individual liberty is not overturned. So in that light, I come back to the question, where in the Constitution does the federal government find the power to ban or regulate drugs? In 1920, at least with alcohol, people understood this. When they wanted to ban alcohol, they passed a constitutional amendment. We can make all sorts of criticisms about the prohibitionists of that era, but at least they had the honesty to say we're going to need a constitutional amendment to ban alcohol all over this country. They went through the actual amendment process. But we have never passed a constitutional amendment giving the federal government any power to ban marijuana or cocaine or any other drug. The federal government's contemporary prohibition policy is an illegal and unconstitutional usurpation of the power never granted to it. One of the key insights of the founders was the need to divide power. They did this in several ways. They divided power between two houses of Congress, between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and perhaps most importantly, they divided power between the state and federal governments. In the 20th century, power has tended to flow to the central government in defiance of the Constitution. Now, in some places, there is a resurgence of federalism, of people demanding that power be returned to the states or the local communities so that government can be closer to the people it will affect. The resurgence of federalism turned up in 1995 in the Supreme Court's Lopez decision, in which Chief Justice Rehnquist began his majority decision. We start with first principles. The Constitution creates a federal government of enumerated powers. And that was very important. It had been a long time since the Supreme Court had said there is something that exceeds the powers of the federal government. Well, right now, the drug reform movement is testing the strength of federalism. Several states, as you know, have passed medical marijuana laws, and the federal government has not responded graciously to this challenge to its dominance. Those initiatives began in 1996. The Clinton administration immediately announced, without any intervening authorization from Congress, leave aside the Constitution, without even asking Congress what it thought should be done, the Clinton administration announced that any physician recommending or prescribing medicinal marijuana under state law could be prosecuted. In February 1997, the Office of National Drug Control Policy announced that federal policy would be 1, physicians who recommend and prescribe medicinal marijuana to patients in conformity with state law and patients who use such marijuana would be prosecuted. Physicians who recommend and prescribe medicinal marijuana in conformity with state law will be excluded from Medicare and Medicaid. And physicians who recommend and prescribe medicinal marijuana to patients in conformity with state law would have their scheduled drug DEA registrations revoked. Clearly, this is a blatant effort by the federal government to impose a national policy on the people in the states in question, people who have already elected a contrary policy. Federal officials don't agree with the policy the people selected, and they mean to override it, no matter what the voters in the several states say, which is nothing new for the Clinton administration. They had tried to go into court or in other ways override other initiatives, which a lot of people here may not agree with. California initiatives dealing with racial preferences and state benefits for immigration, for instance. But in all these cases, the Clinton administration said we reserve to the federal government the power to decide. So let's return to first principles. Ours is a federal republic. The federal government has only the powers granted to it in the Constitution. And the United States has a tradition of individual liberty, vigorous civil society, and limited government. That means that just because a problem is identified does not mean that the government ought to undertake to solve it. And just because a problem occurs in more than one state does not mean that it is a proper subject for federal policy. Perhaps no area more clearly demonstrates the bad consequences of not following such rules than drug prohibition. The long federal experiment in prohibition of marijuana and other drugs has given us unprecedented crime and corruption, combined with a manifest failure to stop the use of drugs or reduce their availability to children. What are the consequences of our unlibertarian marijuana laws? Well, the drug laws break up families. That's supposed to be an important concern of ours these days. Too many parents have been separated from their children because they were convicted of marijuana possession, small-scale sale of drugs, or some other non-violent offense. I talked earlier about some people who are victims of unjust power. Talk about Will Foster. He used marijuana to control the pain and swelling associated with his rheumatoid arthritis. He was arrested, convicted of marijuana cultivation, and sentenced to 93 years in prison. Later, very generously reduced to 20 years in prison. He's got 3 children. Are those children better off with a father who uses marijuana medicinally, or a father they're not going to see for 20 years because he's in prison? And going to jail for drug offenses isn't just for men anymore. In 1996, almost 200,000 women were arrested for violating drug laws. Now, most of them didn't go to jail, of course, but in 96, there were 150,000 women behind bars, and more than 2/3 of them have children. One of them is Brenda Pearson. She was a heroin addict who had managed to maintain a job at a securities firm in New York. She supplied heroin to an addict friend who had moved to Michigan and couldn't find heroin there. A Michigan prosecutor had Brenda Pearson extradited, prosecuted, and sentenced to 50 to 200 years for supplying a drug to a friend. We can only hope that her 2 children will remember her when she gets out. And speaking of children, I hope some of you saw this op-ed piece in the Washington Post yesterday about over-medicating America's children. It's a pediatrician in Walnut Creek, California. We've got this massive program to keep marijuana away from children. Meanwhile, according to this guy, 4 million children younger than 18 are being prescribed drugs, and I'm going to read the ones he mentions in here. Children, and when I say under 18, this is down to children as young as 2 years old, being given behavioral drugs such as Ritalin, lithium, Zoloft, Risperdal, Dexedrine, Adderall, Prozac, Paxil, Clonidine, Depakote, Neurontin, and Luvox. And my apologies for mispronunciations of some of those. What are they thinking? We try to keep a pretty benign drug away from children, and then we prescribe, that's 12 different kinds of mind-altering drugs to children. 2-year-olds who have depression, behavioral problems, 7-year-old boys who are hyperactive. You know, there may be something that actually is hyperactivity, but as I recall, most 7-year-old boys are pretty active. I think there's a real corruption going on in the way we think about drugs. The consequences: drug prohibition also leads to civil liberties abuses. Because this war is unwinnable, the effort to win it has led to wiretapping, entrapment, property seizures, and other abuses of Americans' traditional liberties. The saddest cases result in the deaths of innocent people. People like Donald Scott, who was accused of having marijuana, whose home was raided at dawn, who was shot and killed when he rushed into the living room carrying a gun, as any American would if he heard people bursting into his home at 6 a.m. Or people like the Reverend Aislinn Williams, a 75-year-old minister who died of a heart attack when police burst into his Boston apartment looking for drugs. They had the wrong apartment. Or people like Ezekiel Hernandez, who was out tending his goats near the Rio Grande just 6 days after his 18th birthday when he was shot by a Marine patrol looking for drug smugglers. As we deliberate the costs and benefits of drug policy, we should keep those people in mind. And speaking of consequences, how about this one? Drugs make you crazy. Now, when I say, I don't mean you exactly, I mean the drugs make politicians crazy. They try to out-wacko each other in the ways that they would escalate this unwinnable war. They trip all over themselves trying to explain or conceal their own drug use. They're afraid to walk down the street 2 days before the New Hampshire primary. And they stridently insist that it is unacceptable. It is treason